October 8th, 1871, Peshtigo, Wisconsin. On a single autumn night, a wall of fire, moving faster than a man could run, swept through a small logging town and the surrounding forest, killing an estimated 1,500 to 2,500 people in a matter of hours. It remains, to this day, the deadliest wildfire in United States history. And yet, almost nobody has ever heard of it. Here's why. On that exact same night, several hundred miles away, a much smaller fire broke out in a city barn in Chicago. It killed roughly 300 people. It destroyed a few square miles of the city, and it became one of the most famous disasters in American history, remembered for a century and a half, while Peshtigo, a fire that killed at least 5 times as many people, vanished almost entirely from national memory. This is the story of the deadliest fire in American history, the one that history forgot. To understand what happened at Peshtigo, you first need to understand what the land around it had become by 1871. The town sat in the heart of Wisconsin's booming logging country, an industry that was consuming the state's vast pine forests at a staggering pace to feed the lumber demands of a rapidly industrializing nation. Peshtigo itself was a company town, built almost entirely around a large woodenware factory and sawmill complex owned by Chicago businessman William Ogden, one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest, and, in a grim irony, also the single largest private landowner affected by that same night's fire in Chicago. Logging in this era was brutally wasteful by modern standards. Crews took only the most valuable timber and left everything else behind: branches, treetops, sawdust, and discarded wood, scattered across the forest floor in enormous quantities. On top of that, farmers throughout the region were using a common and, at the time, unremarkable practice: burning off cleared land to prepare fields for planting, a technique known as slash-and-burn agriculture. Small fires were an ordinary, almost weekly occurrence across the region that autumn. By the summer and early fall of 1871, the entire upper Midwest was gripped by an unusually severe drought. Rainfall had been scarce for months. The forest floor, already littered with loggers' debris and dried out by the drought, had effectively become a vast, sprawling tinderbox stretching across hundreds of square miles, waiting only for a spark and the right wind to turn it into something catastrophic. Here's a detail almost nobody knows. In the days and weeks leading up to October 8th, residents throughout the region had grown used to living with smoke. Small brush fires and land clearing burns had been smoldering across the countryside for weeks, filling the air with a persistent haze. Some accounts describe the sun appearing dim and reddish through the smoke for days at a time. Just as familiarity with hurricane warnings would numb Gulf Coast residents to real danger more than a century later, the constant low-level presence of smoke and small fires that autumn dulled residents' sense of alarm. Fire, to the people of Peshtigo, had simply become part of the season's ordinary background noise. October 8th, 1871. A cold front was moving in from the west, and with it came powerful, gusting winds. Exactly what ignited the specific blaze that became the Peshtigo fire remains debated by historians to this day. It may have been sparked by one of the many ongoing land-clearing fires suddenly catching a gust of wind, or possibly multiple smaller fires converging as the wind pushed them together. What's certain is that sometime in the early evening, the fire's behavior changed entirely. As the wind intensified, the fire began to do something that stunned everyone who witnessed it and survived. It stopped behaving like an ordinary forest fire spreading gradually along the ground, and instead became what meteorologists and fire scientists now call a firestorm. A fire so large and so intensely hot that it began generating its own weather system. The fire's heat caused the air directly above it to rise with tremendous force, pulling in surrounding air to replace it, which in turn fed the fire even more oxygen, creating a self-sustaining feedback loop of ever-increasing intensity. Survivors and later investigators described phenomena that sound almost impossible. Witnesses reported what looked and sounded like a tornado of fire, a spinning column of flame and superheated wind capable of picking up entire houses, animals, and even people and hurling them through the air. The fire's own wind system, driven by the storm force gusts already present that night, is estimated to have reached speeds comparable to a hurricane, pushing a wall of flame across the landscape faster than any person could outrun it. Survivors consistently described hearing the fire before they saw it, a deep, continuous roar that many compared to a passing freight train, or, in some accounts, distant cannon fire, growing louder and louder in the minutes before the flames themselves became visible over the tree line. By the time the glow was visible on the horizon, for many residents, there was no longer any real chance of escape by road. The fire was moving too fast, and it was already surrounding the town from multiple directions simultaneously, cutting off routes that might otherwise have offered safety. When the fire hit Peshtigo directly, witnesses described the town essentially exploding into flame almost all at once, rather than burning gradually, building by building, as a normal town fire would. The intense heat is believed to have caused what's known as spontaneous combustion in some structures, wooden buildings and even piles of sawdust reportedly bursting into flame from radiant heat alone, before the fire itself had even physically reached them. The temperature within the firestorm has been estimated by later researchers to have potentially reached as high as 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in places, hot enough to melt sand into glass, and hot enough to instantly kill anyone caught directly in its path, often before they had any chance to react. For those who survived, nearly all of them owed their lives to one thing: the Peshtigo River, which ran directly through the center of town. As the fire closed in from every direction, hundreds of residents made a desperate run for the water, plunging in fully clothed, some carrying children, others dragging livestock, anyone who could reach it in time. Even the river itself became a battle for survival. The firestorm's heat was so intense that it scorched and injured people even while they were submerged, forcing survivors to repeatedly duck their heads fully underwater for as long as they could hold their breath, then surface only long enough to gasp air that was itself scalding hot and thick with smoke, before submerging again. Falling embers and flaming debris rained down onto the water's surface throughout the night. Survivors described watching floating logs and debris catch fire around them, even as they clung to the same pieces of wood for support. Some who stayed in the river too long succumbed to hypothermia in the October cold, even as the world around them burned. It was, by nearly every survivor account, a night of choosing between two different ways to die, and hoping desperately to avoid both. Peshtigo itself was only the epicenter. The fire's true scale was almost incomprehensible. It ultimately burned across an estimated 1.2 million to 2.4 million acres of forest and farmland across northeastern Wisconsin and into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, an area comparable in size to the entire state of Connecticut. Well over a dozen small towns and rural communities beyond Peshtigo itself were destroyed or severely damaged that same night, many of them so remote and so completely obliterated that accurate death tolls from those outlying communities were never fully established, which is part of why historians still debate the fire's true total death count to this day, with estimates ranging from around 1,500 up to as many as 2,500 people. In some of the more isolated farming communities, entire families were found later, having died together in fields or root cellars where they had fled, believing incorrectly that the exposed ground or underground shelter would protect them from a fire that, due to the firestorm's unique behavior, could kill through radiant heat and superheated air even without direct flame contact. Here is the detail that defines Peshtigo's entire legacy and the central mystery of why it remains so obscure. The Great Chicago Fire began that same night, October 8, 1871, just a few hundred miles south. Chicago was already, by 1871, one of the most important and closely watched cities in America, a rapidly growing hub of national commerce, finance, and journalism, with reporters, telegraph lines, and national newspaper syndicates all concentrated there. Peshtigo, by contrast, was a small, remote logging town. Its telegraph lines were destroyed by the fire itself, cutting off communication with the outside world for days. By the time word of the disaster's true scale finally reached major newspapers, the nation's entire attention and virtually all of its journalistic resources were already fully consumed by coverage of Chicago, a story that had a several-day head start and access to reporters already on the ground. When accounts of Peshtigo did eventually reach the press, some newspapers initially struggled to believe the death toll being reported, assuming it must be exaggerated, since it dwarfed the already shocking numbers coming out of Chicago. The disaster that actually killed far more people never caught up in public consciousness, and in the century and a half since, it largely never has. William Ogden, the Chicago businessman who owned Peshtigo's main factory and much of the surrounding land, holds a strange and largely forgotten distinction. He is believed to be the only person in American history to have lost a fortune in two major fires, occurring in different states on the exact same night. His Chicago properties burned in the Great Chicago Fire, while his Peshtigo lumber operation, representing the bulk of the town's economy, was simultaneously being destroyed hundreds of miles away. Despite the staggering losses, historical accounts suggest Ogden personally contributed significant relief funds to Peshtigo's rebuilding efforts in the aftermath, one of the more overlooked acts of individual disaster philanthropy of the era. When the fire finally burned itself out, having consumed virtually every combustible structure in its path, Peshtigo itself had been almost completely wiped from the map. Of the roughly 1,700 to 2,000 residents believed to have been living in the town itself before the fire, historians estimate that at least 800, and possibly significantly more, died there alone, with total regional deaths across all affected communities reaching into the 1,500 to 2,500 range. The fire remains, by a wide margin, the deadliest wildfire in United States history, more than double the death toll of any wildfire that has occurred in the country since, including the major California wildfires of the 21st century that dominate modern headlines. Total property damage across the region was estimated in the millions of $1871, an enormous sum for the era, though the human cost has always overshadowed the financial one in any honest account of what happened. Among the hundreds of survivor accounts collected in the years after the fire, one stands out as perhaps the most harrowing on record. A young sawmill worker, one of the few from his own street to survive the night at all, later described running from his house the moment he heard the roar approaching, only to watch the wind itself seem to catch fire in the air above him, streaks of flame racing across the sky faster than anything on the ground could move. He described the heat as arriving before the flames themselves did, so intense that his own hair and eyebrows singed away in seconds, even while he was still nearly 100 yards from the nearest visible fire. He reached the river alongside a small group of neighbors, but not before watching, in his own words given years later to a local historian, a man just a few feet ahead of him simply stop moving mid-stride and collapse, killed instantly by the superheated air itself, rather than by direct flame contact, a death several other survivors independently described witnessing that same night. He would spend the following hours submerged to his neck in the freezing river. Watching the sky above him turn shades of orange and black, he said he never had adequate words to describe afterward. Surrounded by the sounds of collapsing buildings, screaming livestock, and increasingly, as the night wore on, silence where there had been screaming only minutes before. By the time the sun rose, he was one of only a handful of people from his immediate street still alive. He reportedly never spoke about that specific night in detail again for the remaining decades of his life, except in the single interview his account survives from. And even then, according to the person who recorded it, he paused for nearly a full minute before he could describe the moment his neighbor died beside him. Accounts like his are part of why historians studying Peshtigo describe it as a fire that killed not only through flame, but through the sheer invisible heat of the air itself, a detail that separates it from almost every other wildfire disaster in American history, and helps explain why so many victims were later found with little to no visible burn damage on their bodies at all, having been killed instead by the superheated atmosphere the firestorm generated around itself. A young mother, identified in later survivor accounts only by her married name, spent the entire night standing chest deep in the Peshtigo River, holding her infant child above her head with both arms the entire time, to keep the baby's face above the surface and away from the floating embers, alternating between submerging herself for protection from the heat and desperately holding her arms steady above water regardless. Both she and her child survived the night, though she reportedly never fully regained the strength in her arms afterward. A Catholic priest serving the largely immigrant Belgian and French-Canadian farming communities outside Peshtigo is remembered for repeatedly running back into the advancing fire zone to help guide disoriented and panicked families toward the river, reportedly making several trips before he himself was overcome. His body was found the next day, not far from where witnesses last saw him, leading a group of survivors toward the water. A local doctor, one of the only medical providers for the entire region, worked through the night and the days that followed with severely limited supplies, treating burns using whatever materials could be salvaged, and is credited by several survivor accounts with saving lives that otherwise would have been lost to infection and untreated injury in the disaster's immediate aftermath, working in conditions with almost no functioning medical infrastructure left standing anywhere nearby. One detail that survivors return to again and again in later accounts involves the town's Catholic church, which many residents initially fled toward, assuming a large stone or brick structure would offer better protection than their wooden homes. Peshtigo's church, like nearly every other building in the largely wood-built logging town, was constructed almost entirely of timber. Those who sheltered inside it, rather than continuing on to the river, were, in nearly every documented case, killed when the structure ignited and collapsed. It's a grim, largely forgotten counterpart to the axe in the attic lesson from later disasters. The instinct to seek shelter in a familiar, solid-seeming building can be fatally wrong when the danger itself doesn't behave the way past experience has taught people to expect. Livestock and wildlife suffered losses on a scale that's rarely discussed alongside the human toll, but which surviving accounts describe in haunting detail. Farmers throughout the region lost nearly their entire herds in a single night, animals unable to be freed from barns and pens in time, or which panicked and ran directly into the fire rather than away from it. Survivors in the river that night also described a strange and eerie phenomenon: deer, wolves, and other wild animals fleeing the fire alongside them, sharing the same stretch of water as the terrified townspeople. A rare moment where the region's usual predator and prey dynamics were entirely suspended in the face of a shared, greater threat neither species had ever encountered before. For decades after 1871, the exact mechanics of what made the Peshtigo fire behave so differently from an ordinary forest fire remained poorly understood, described mostly through survivor testimony rather than scientific analysis. It wasn't until the 20th century, particularly following further study of large-scale firestorm events during and after World War II, that meteorologists and fire scientists developed a fuller understanding of how a fire of sufficient size and intensity can begin generating its own self-sustaining wind system, sometimes called a fire tornado or fire whirl in modern terminology. Retrospective analysis using this later scientific understanding strongly suggests that Peshtigo was one of the earliest well-documented examples of this phenomenon in American history, occurring decades before science had the tools or vocabulary to properly explain what witnesses were describing. Because Chicago's fire absorbed nearly all of the nation's immediate charitable attention and press coverage, Peshtigo's relief effort, in comparison, was noticeably smaller and slower to organize, despite the region's higher death toll and arguably greater need. Wisconsin's governor and a small number of regional relief organizations did eventually coordinate supply shipments of food, blankets, and building materials to the devastated region. But the scale of national donations never approached what poured into Chicago in the same weeks. Some historians studying the disaster's aftermath have pointed to this disparity as one of the earliest documented examples of what disaster researchers now sometimes call an attention gap, where the scale of a tragedy and the scale of the public response to it can become almost entirely disconnected from one another, based more on visibility and location than on actual human suffering. Peshtigo was rebuilt in the years following the fire, though it never grew into anything resembling a major city, remaining to this day a small Wisconsin town of a few thousand residents. The Peshtigo Fire Museum, housed in a church rebuilt on the same ground as the original, now stands as one of the only dedicated memorials to the disaster anywhere in the country, and a mass grave containing many of the unidentified dead sits in the adjoining cemetery, a quieter, far less visited counterpart to more famous American disaster memorials. Peshtigo exposed something that Chicago's fire, for all its fame, never fully forced the country to confront: that the deadliest disasters don't always happen to the most visible or most powerful places, and that history's memory of tragedy often has less to do with how many people died than with who was watching and who had a telegraph line still standing to tell the world about it. More than a century and a half later, the deadliest wildfire in American history remains, for most people, a story they've simply never heard, burning quietly in the shadow of a much smaller fire that happened by pure coincidence to catch fire in a city with better connections to tell its own story first.